All right, this is Tim Cain on game difficulty settings, which oddly enough have been in two of the games that I've worked on, and one of them for Train Life, for the train game I worked on, I very extensively pushed having customization options for the game, so that players could tailor the game exactly to their likes, or even start multiple profiles, one that was maybe a bit easier, a bit harder than the other. So I'm generally a fan. I generally think that if it's a single player game, you should play it the way you want. If you want to cheat, if you want to make something harder or easier, that's up to you.
Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim.
Hi,
And
Tim.
today I want to talk about game difficulty.
Me too.
Specifically, I got a question from Noah Calder 4279 who asks, I'd love if you could share your thoughts on difficulty in RPGs. Do you think customizable difficulties such as settings and sliders work well in RPGs? Which are the best methods of making RPGs difficult? And should RPGs get easier or more difficult the further a player advances through the game?
Let me give my answer to that. I think number one, it is up to the developers of the game. It is their game. However, games have audiences, and they have to have audiences because they have to make money. So it's also up to the audience. And if the audience wants something like that, the developers need to cater to that a little bit. But that doesn't mean that it needs to be that way. And if there's a large enough niche that doesn't want difficulty, take From Software for instance, that's okay. That's okay. One difficulty, some people want that, and I think that's perfectly okay too. What was the last part of that?
Methods of making RPGs difficult, and should RPGs get easier or more difficult the further a player advances through the game?
Okay, so what are the methods of making your? I mean, that one's. I'm not going to answer that one. That one we can talk about in a moment. And should I forgot the last part of that.
Easier or more difficult the further a player advances through methods of making RPGs difficult, and should RPGs get easier or more difficult the further a player advances through the game?
Okay, that's why. Because it was kind of. I thought that's what it was, but it was kind of confusing me with that. Should they get easier or more difficult? I don't know if I would describe it like that. I think that a game should remain as challenging. I think a game should aim for a median level of challenge, but that doesn't mean that like you should do enemy scaling necessarily. That doesn't really that's kind of I think the easiest, most low quality way of handling that challenge. I think in more cases the player is going to learn how to play the game better, and you need to keep introducing challenges to the game that keep the player on their toes, right? So let's take a game like Doom, for example. Well, it's easy to fight one Revenant. Well, now how about two? How about three? How about two plus some imps, right? And this is a very generally easy way to get the player familiar with, in this case, one enemy type. Will now get used to fighting two of them at the same time. Now get used to fighting two of them plus some trash mobs at the same time, right? That is increasing the it's not really increasing the difficulty, it is just keeping the player's challenge level about the same, maybe increasing it slightly. And yeah, I wouldn't really qualify it as should games become easier or harder as they go on. I think that some games do become easier as they go on because they use friction points or pain points, since we just talked about that, as a means of progressing or limiting the progression of the player. So like, oh, your inventory capacity is only 5 slots. Well, now it's 10 slots. Well, now it's 20 slots. It's like, well, is the game really easier or harder? Or have you just made the game a little bit frustrating to engage with early on, but then less frustrating to engage with later on? I need a more opt-in type of difficulty where the world just has different challenges throughout that have varying difficulties. Yeah, and I think that's a good way to do it. Thank you, Lukash, for the follow. Hope you enjoy this day. Let's continue on with game difficulty.
That is a set of good questions. that all fall under game difficulty. So I thought, okay, time to do a game difficulty video. So just up front, I do like customizable difficulty
Me too.
settings. I think anything that makes a player turn the game into something they'd like more, I'm not against. Frequently in my career, I've had arguments with people, designers,
Me too.
programmers, who think that every time you put an option in a game, it's because you couldn't make a decision.
Yes, yes. In fact, it's mostly players that I hear that argument from. That not all. I'm not going to blame all players, right? But I've heard this a lot from players where the designers put difficulty options in the game because they couldn't decide on a difficulty for the game. That's usually not what it is. It's usually so that the game can appeal to different groups of players who find certain aspects of the game easier or harder than others. Sometimes they can be accessibility settings. So for instance, if you just have really bad rhythm, one thing Star Wars Outlaws did very well was it got rid of the lockpicking minigame, which was based on rhythm, right? And that, yes, it's a difficulty setting, but it's not like it hurts your ability to play it if you like it and somebody else doesn't. But I can also understand cases where, like with From Software games, there is a prestige to beating the game on the default difficulty. Plus, I think with Elden Ring, the game is already so easy that you don't need difficulty settings. Maybe not the DLC, but the main game is pretty easy. I don't consider difficulty, I consider accessibility. I think that's a good way to look at it too, for certain things. You know, I inserted like infinite money into one of my games as a optional difficulty setting, you know, a cheat that you could turn on at the game. Yeah, it's like, well, if you just want to play around, you don't want to have to deal with the economy, sure, go for it. If you want to reduce the grind or increase the grind, I added an option for that too. Maybe you see yourself playing this for a long time, you like having that challenge, yeah, go for it. And Wave Money Game, hey Velma, hey, it's good to see you guys today. So yeah, I think that difficulty options, I'm fully in support of it. I understand why developers don't do it. I'm not upset at them for that. I think that it depends on the game. It depends on the audience. But if for like an RPG game, for like a solo game, man, do what you want. Designers have an obligation to save players from themselves. It's an interesting question. Sometimes yes. Sometimes yes. Making life infinite to allow for the story to be front and center, making any door openable by any key instead of specific ones. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I think story modes are great for games. Journalist modes, essentially, as we call them, right? They're good. They're good for gamers who just want to be able to experience the story. You want hard difficulty, we just make you your encumbrance walk the whole time. Yeah. See, I'm not a fan of that. I'm not a fan of difficulty modes that... Or I'm not a fan of things... I'm especially not a fan of progression that creates pain points, like artificial pain points, that the player can augment with perks later down the line. I'm just not a fan of that.
And I see where they're coming from. There were sometimes I couldn't decide what was better, and I thought, well, maybe I'll make an option, and you can flip back and forth between these two.
Well, sure.
But
that doesn't mean you're a bad designer.
Their argument, and I see their argument is also it's hard to make your game good when you get to the balancing fun stage because you have to balance it against all these possible options that the player may set.
Yeah.
However, I also view it as an accessibility thing. Like I said, I have a friend who likes to play games because he's a level designer, and he always sets the game's difficulty to easy because what he wants to do is see the game, not necessarily get stuck on a particularly difficult combat encounter.
Well, a lot of people just don't have the time either. I mean, sometimes difficulty settings can drastically lower or increase the time it takes to complete the game, and some people just want to play it, have their fun, and then go on with the next game or get on with their life. Very, very understandable. I like the concept of carry it because it requires inventory management, which I'm terrible at, so it gets really goofy at some point. I think though that there's a balance, right? Where if where's a grid? I just need a grid right now. I need a grid. I'll draw on it. Okay. Here is your inventory for your game. Yeah. Here is your inventory for the game. Okay, it's in the red. Now, here is about how much inventory all of the items in the level take up in terms of space. I think that's a bit too extreme. Like, if you think of something like Resident Evil, right? This would be way too extreme. But if it were like this, well, now you have some management, right? And if it were like this, you don't have any choice at all. Like, it's just, okay, pick up everything on to go. So, you don't create any friction point here, and therefore, why do you have an inventory grid at all? You create too much of a pain point here, and now the game can be really frustrating to engage with. But here, something like this, that many items, that's a lot more understandable. I think that's a lot more fair, and that's what balance comes down to. And so creating inventory management, having inventory management in your game is great, but it needs to be balanced, and that is a difficult thing to do.
And I agree with that. That's a perfectly valid way of playing the game. So that's how I view game difficulty sliders. It's something that people want to adjust to their level of personal, comfort playing the game.
Yeah.
Now there's a whole bunch of ways you can make the game more difficult. I have an entire video on enemy progression and how I like to do it. So you may want to go watch that. I'll put a link below. But one thing you can do to make a game harder when you set it to be, I want this game to be more difficult, is whatever your algorithm is for that enemy progression, which is probably based on the level of the player, just push it up a little. Maybe when you
10, 20%, 20% is quite a lot.
A combat encounter occurs, you pass in the player's level +5 if you're playing on hard difficulty.
Yeah.
Or maybe the player's level -3 if you're playing on an easy difficulty.
Well, even games without levels, you can just boost up health or damage or something. Although I think that this is in some cases the laziest way to do it. If you want to do a health and damage based difficulty for a game like, let's just say, Skyrim, in my opinion, the better way to do it is balance around the default first, and then if you want to make the game harder, just make the player take more damage. Don't affect how much damage the player does to enemies necessarily. However, it all needs to be balanced around number of hits in a lot of cases rather than DPS. Damage per hit can also be important here too, where if the player can too easily take 2 hits of damage and die, and your difficulties increase that from 5, from 5 to 2 hits, that's just way too much. It's way too easy to take 2 hits and die, and you have no real strategy or choice as the player. Aim more for just 1 or 2 hits, and you can adjust that on a per enemy basis or just from a percentage basis, but it's not as simple as just percentage increase across the board of enemy health, because now enemies are more bullet spongy. Now it just feels like the player is having to put 10,000 arrows into the head of a creature, and where's the fun in that, right? So I think making it more lethal for the player is the right way to go about it. I know that Doom, I believe, did this really well. They not only made it more lethal for the player, but they increased the reactivity of AI, which is a great way to do difficulty for a game like that, because that is directly tying difficulty to player skills, awareness, and their reaction times.
If you really want to make like a super hard level, you could pass in the player's level ×2. Because then the game would start off just a little bit harder than it would normally be at level 1 and 2, but it would quickly become much more difficult, which is what some people want.
People do want that.
That is one way you can do it. And that's an easy way. If you do enemy progression the way I suggested, that's a pretty easy way to implement a game difficulty slider. Another thing you could do is numerical changes. Those are the easiest.
Yep, they are.
Things like the player has less hit points, or the monsters have more. The player has slower health regeneration, or maybe they don't have any health regeneration in combat, or maybe they don't have any health regeneration outside of combat. Maybe you have to sleep, rest somewhere to get your health back, and rest requires food and camp supplies, or you can only do it in a particular place, or maybe you can only do it someplace like an inn where you pay for. So now health regeneration is gated behind something, which makes the player really question, can I keep going forward with the health I'm at now? It makes the game harder.
It's a
You
pretty
can
reasonable
also,
way of doing it
as a
too.
purely numerical thing, say every skill check in the game on hard mode is a little harder. So I talk about at one point where you set skill checks as a instead of having everyone who puts a skill check in saying I'm checking against 70 or I'm checking against 80, they mark skill checks as this is an easy check, this is a medium check, this is a hard check, this is a very hard check, which then transfers via a table to how difficult the skill checks are going to be tested actually in the game. I said you could do that in order to, when you get to the final balancing phase, you may want to adjust. Maybe a medium check isn't checking against 50, maybe it's checking against 60. You can do that. That's one reason the table exists, but you can also make a separate table for separate game difficulties. So a hard check in easy mode might be 50, in normal mode might be 75, in hard mode might be 85, and in difficult mode might be 95. So that's a good way of making combat difficulties with no code changes whatsoever.
I think though that with skill checks you have to be a little bit careful with how much content was specifically designed to be available to the player at a lower level. By increasing that minimum threshold, you could be making the early game, which is arguably in many cases the most crucial, way too overtuned. I think there's also a potential worry case, but with like dice checks, right? I know that Baldur's Gate had some of this issue where I think, let's pretend this, you're playing D&D, right? And you make a speech to the DM for your persuasion check. Based on the actual speech you give, a good DM would lower the DC in order to reward you as a tabletop player for making a really good speech. You can't really do this in a video game that easily. So a lot of the DC checks that I experienced in like Baldur's Gate 3 were just really annoying to the point where it was kind of unfun. It's like, bro, there's no DM in history that would put a DC check this high, especially considering the things that I've said to this NPC before. You're kind of forcing me to save scum because I want the good outcome, but you haven't put the good outcome in reach that makes it feel realistic for the choices I've made. So you have to be a little bit careful with checks like that and the pain points that might be caused. But the game did allow for saves coming, so at the end of the day, I don't look back on it in the greatest of light, but it still allowed me to get around it. RDR2 let's just let animals fuck up your day if we got it off a mountain. RDR2 also, the hunting system, the hunting feature of Red Dead Redemption 2 is extremely well designed. It is a hunting system that allows you to engage with as much challenge as you want by attempting to go for perfect pelts, which can then bolster your end game progression for ammo pouches, right? So Red Dead Redemption 2's hunting feature is actually one of a really good example that I would give for game designers for a system that is very easy to understand, easy to engage with, but has a high skill ceiling. Very, very great system.
So there's also a lot of non-numerical things you can do that make a game more difficult. You can add food, the requirement to eat food, to drink water, and to sleep. That only occur when you're
like
playing
survival
harder
modes,
difficulties.
right?
We did that in the Outer Worlds. You got hungry, you got thirsty, you got tired, and you had to do those things. And those things cost resources, cost money. So the game is that much more difficult because of that.
Not the biggest fan.
You
of
also
systems
can
like
do
that.
things like, let's get rid of fast travel. You have to walk everywhere. In Outer Worlds, we said you could only fast travel back to the ship. So if you wanted to ever stop for the day, you could just fast travel back to the ship. But that was the only valid fast travel location in Supernova.
I'm okay with removing fast travel from games if your game has other forms of travel. If there are immersive in-game ways of traveling that most players who play normally don't engage with because they can fast travel, but now are kind of forced to engage with because they can't. I do like that if it's well designed. But if it's just we've removed fast travel, but we never designed a way for you to get around the world that easily. Apart from that, it's kind of it's just annoying. Same with like eating, having to eat, drink, and sleep. A lot of times it feels tacked on to the point where it doesn't feel very well balanced. You know, Starfield kind of felt that way, where it's like I just have to eat something every 30 minutes, and it's like, well, this doesn't really do anything to the game. It's just that it's annoying that every time it pops up in the midway through fucking combat, I now have like half of my oxygen meter that I had before. That's not fun. That's just you've crippled me during a time where I don't want to be crippled for no reason. Nobody's in the middle of combat immediately gets hungry and is now like, oh, now I can't shoot properly. Ugh. Fuck off.
Difficulty. When you left the ship, you had to walk wherever you wanted to go, which took time, meant you had to go through encounters again, makes the game that much more difficult. Now, some people are going, well, this just makes the game more, it adds
Tedious.
friction.
I wouldn't say difficult. I would say tedious and challenging, time consuming, right? What's the game? Dragon's Dogma has the same problem, where it's like, well, the constant respawning of lower level shit, it just gets boring after a certain point. It's just tiring. It's so annoying to have to go through the same fucking pack of wolves every fucking time because they respawn every 2 days, but I can't really fast travel that easily.
Almost any difficulty that you can imagine that's harder is friction to some people, while it's difficulty to others. So that's going to be true for all of these. So if that's your
He's right.
Argument against doing these, I don't really have a defense because it's true for everything you're going to do. Now, many RPGs, mine included, only had difficulty sliders for combat, even though there are other ways of playing the game. Stealth, dialogue, those are really common other ways of playing the game. Now, a lot of those say those get more difficult with higher difficulties settings by just making the skill checks higher, which is what I talked about. You know, you can say these skill checks are higher based on the difficulty mode. But there are other things you can do. You could say for stealth in more difficult settings that the detection radius for being seen by enemies is bigger.
I think that detection radius is one way to do stealth difficulty better. I really think, though, for certain games, you need to take your time and you say, okay, well, now we have more challenging patrol routes for the guards in this region. We've added an additional guard. We've limited the number of entry points to this place, or we've added some traps to entry points on harder difficulties, right? So harder difficulties are still strategic, but you feel like it's different enough that it is engaging you. There are ways to do it that if you design the game to have that from the ground up, I think it can be really rewarding to players playing on harder difficulties, and it can even offer replay value as opposed to just simply being some numerical buff. Now, having 2 additional guards and having harder patrol routes, that completely changes your strategy for entering and exiting that mansion and staying stealthy, right? Or a game that like Dishonored, which rewards you for getting through places without killing anyone and without getting seen. These are additional challenges that add difficulty, but are actually not. They don't actually make you have to do anything in terms of a programmer. It's just, well, now, did you kill anyone? Yes or no? Things like that. And those work really well.
Or when you're being viewed, the detection rate. In other words, somebody sees you and some bar goes like this, and when it hits the bottom, they've seen you and they come after you. That falls down.
Fills up,
the rate at which it collapses is faster at higher difficulty levels.
It's a good way to do it too.
Do that. Similarly, with dialogue, in addition to skill checks, you could just say whatever you need to have a successful dialogue statement. Remember, I've talked about maybe dialogue should involve getting evidence for things. We did that in Fallout. You couldn't just walk up to the master and say, all of the mutants are sterile. You had to prove it. And you had to prove it by talking to a Brotherhood of Steel scientist named Vree and getting a holodisk of that data, of that evidence. So, one thing you could do is you could say evidence that you need to support dialogue statements in conversations are harder to reach. Maybe you can mark some of the evidence and it moves to a location that's more difficult. Or it moves to,
Yeah.
or if it's in a container, the lock on that container becomes more difficult. Or if it's somebody that you have to talk to, maybe they move to a more difficult place, or maybe there's an alternate person who is farther into an area. Maybe you have to do quests to reach that person. Maybe you have to talk to more people or sneak past people. That person is just harder to reach for some reason. These require more work, but once you set them up, then they just automatically change when you change.
They require more work, but I think in almost every single scenario, players appreciate it more and will more fondly remember your game, and your game will have more replayability by putting that time and effort in. That the density and care that you put into that will pay off. Almost, I could, if we want to go like metric wise, I would just say it pays off one for one. That the amount of work that it takes, it's going to pay off. Rather than being something that's so small and insignificant that, yeah, you can add it, but it's really not going to benefit players, and it's going to take it's going to take 2 weeks of time to implement. No, the time that you put into, I think, making good difficulty options that change the game in that way do pay off, and people will more fondly remember those levels or those sections. And like I said, may actually end up playing the game again just to experience that after they've become comfortable and familiar with the base game's difficulty and challenge.
Change the difficulty settings. So those are things you can do to make the game more difficult, not just in combat. And then finally, there's some things you can do that are neither numerical or non-numerical. I consider them less hand-holding. And these are things you can literally revert to how games used to be when they were harder. Some people will never want this. They view it as
I think I know some of the things
we
he's trying to
stopped
bring
doing
up.
these in older games for a reason, but other people miss it.
Like no
These
hints.
include things like when you get a quest, there is no quest marker.
Yeah, there's no markers.
The person will tell you where to go, or tell you roughly where to go. I think the bandit's hidden up in a cave up north, but you have to go find it. You don't get a marker on your map saying, "Oh, there's the cave with the."
I think that there are a lot of players, by the way, who say they want this because they think it would be cool. And then when they play it, they're like, "Okay, you know what? I didn't want that. This is just too annoying."
Bandits in it. Maybe you don't
Not
have
all
maps.
players.
There were a lot of older games that didn't have maps.
Mm-hmm.
They might have had a world map, but no local map. They might have had a town map, but no dungeon map. Some didn't have maps at all. Those are something that came later. People liked making maps themselves or writing down what they needed to do. It's basically less hand-holding for the player and makes the game more difficult. You could also get rid of the quest log. If you really wanted to go hardcore, you could say, you have no quest log. If someone tells you to do something, you got to remember what they told you to do and what they want you to get and who it is who asked and where they're located.
I think that's too extreme. Yes, some old games used to do that. I think that a good compromise for we want the player to think and to engage rather than just read a quest log and know what to do is Larian Studios. I think what they do with their logs, which are more like journals of related to this category, we went here. We talked to this person about this. And it doesn't really tell you what to do next unless the NPC specifically mentions that. It just keeps a log of your relations or actions that have to do with that category until the game has deemed that complete. And I think that that's more enjoyable because that allows you to not have to memorize between play sessions what you were doing, but rather I have a few open things. Here's exactly what I did, and now we're just investigating further. We're seeing what happens. I think that's a much better way to do it. It depends on what experience they're looking for. Yeah, I mean, as with anything with game design, it depends. Depends on your market, depends on your game. Most games don't make you feel like a local enough to be able to pull that off. Yeah, you're right about that. You are right. It's a tough thing to get right, but I think if you do it right, players will appreciate that more than games that hold your hand. Like Elden Ring. Elden Ring was blasted by some game developers because it didn't hold players' hands. It didn't tell them where to go next. It just gave them a, oh, in this direction. Where? That direction. Somewhere in that direction. By that thing. What you have to do in there, who you have to fight, or what you have to find. You'll find out. And I think that players unanimously loved that because it was just enough guidance and the level design and world design was so perfectly on point that the world just engaged them and drew them into various things until they found what they were looking for, but it didn't hold their hands and say, this is where you go, this is what you need to do next. Yeah, Elden Ring goated. I mean, what else can we say? Very much enjoy the lack of quest markers in Morrowind. It's part of the experience. Yeah, and that works really well when NPCs tell you what you're needing to do, or maybe there's like a book that you can read that tells you where the last known location of this hidden artifact is, and then you can go, explore there and discover that, or find it in the world. But it's a careful balance between giving the player enough hints, not holding their hand, and probably having at least a quest log that allows them to not have to remember everything in the game.
Because that makes the game, some people argue it makes the game far more immersive. It's a trivial thing to implement. You can say on hard difficulty, quest log doesn't exist. You hit L for log and nothing happens. So it can be done. But for all of these, the reason I recommend making it an option is that goes too far for some people. That's too much friction. Even though you're making the game more difficult, and they say they want the game more difficult, for some people, difficulty and annoyance, they separate that out, and that may be too annoying. So the question about what is the best way to do this, it's hard to answer. It really depends on your game. It depends on what you're trying to make, what kind of game you're making, what difficulty factor you're trying to hit.
It can even depend on what players expect to be in this genre of game, because other games that have come out recently have set expectations, right? And I think that was maybe one of the... I think with some of the developers that mentioned Baldur's Gate 3 being a bit too high of expectation for other CRPGs, I kind of agreed with that. I think that it wasn't worded very well. But if you take a look at other CRPGs, they don't have anywhere near the level of budget that Baldur's Gate 3 had. So I would like them to, but it's also a pretty niche category of games that if you expect, the next Pathfinder game to have that same level of production quality, it's probably not going to have that. But that doesn't mean that it'll be bad, right? Journal was useful in Morrowind, but sometimes I would take actual notes. I like when a game encourages, or, has... It doesn't tell me to take notes, but I am taking notes because of the game. I do miss that from the old school games. But it has to be, in my opinion, limited. And it has to be something that is more emergent rather than asked for.
What options you want to open up to the players, what you don't, what you have time to code, what you don't.
I'll put it this way, because I thought about it a little bit after I said it. I think that games that allow you to customize your map, like place your own markers, like, oh, I found a locked chest here, I'm going to place a chest marker on the map, and I'm going to come back, and I can add maybe a note on that too when I hover over it. So I really like when things like that happen. We need to add that to the tutorial. Make sure you have notebook and pen at your desk. That could work. That's a good idea. I don't see enough game. I know some games do the markers, but not all games allow you to customize that, like type in a note, and I really wish they did that. Just so that I could say, oh, it's behind this door, has a lock level of 70. And then I can continue, I can look at the map of things that I missed and say, oh, I'm only lock picking 65, so I can't do that yet. The Power World doesn't, it's a lot of fun to find things and slap a marker down the map. Yeah, I think that it absolutely is. I know Elden Ring does that too, with markers, and it works pretty well. And that's a way for you to like, okay, we expect you to take notes in this game, but you can do it in game. You don't have to do it with a piece of paper and pencil.
So I would say, of all the things I just mentioned on how to make a game more difficult, you're going to have to decide for yourself which ones you can use. And then for the final question about should RPGs get easier or harder as you play them, I have a trick. It's a trick question because I have a trick answer. They should get both easier and harder as you
Yes,
play.
he's right.
Because as you play through the game and you get higher level, you want to feel more powerful. You want to be able to stomp on some things.
Yeah.
That's why I don't like level scaling.
Well, it's exactly what I said, is that you need to, it's not about difficulty, it's about challenge. You need to challenge the player in new ways that, forces them to use the tools that they've become accustomed with and have become skillful with to new heights that they didn't expect, right?
Places you've been before that were a little
easier,
difficult
yeah.
for you to get through should be easier when you go through on higher level.
Yep.
Things you've run into before, like maybe those bandits down by the bridge that would always stomp you when you were lower
Yeah.
level. It's fun to go back when you're higher level and stomp them. However,
That's why I don't like enemy
if
scaling.
everything just gets easier as you go up a level, the game just gets easier and easier until finally the end. You hear the common complaint of nothing's challenging.
Yeah, it's like the game was. It's kind of like Skyrim for to some extent, where the game is actually the most enjoyable from like a combat perspective the earlier into the game you are, because you're having to make do with limited resources. You're having to, maybe avoid some encounters, and then it just kind of gets a little out of control. I think that a game that did it really well was Witcher 3. If you don't enable level scaling until after you beat the main story, which is what I recommend, because they have level scaling, they have not, and they don't have level scaling, and it's just an option you can toggle. So turn it off when you start the game, because you'll be avoiding like griffins or leshens that are really high level that you shouldn't go anywhere near. And then once you get higher level, you can turn it up to take those mundane encounters and make them a bit more of a challenge. Level scaling had some game breaking glitches. I heard that. I only played around with it after the game had already been released, so I played the main game without it and I enjoyed it. And I think that's the better way to handle it. I would love if there were a mod for some games that turn that off.
I have tons of money and nothing to spend it on. So I think new places in the game should become harder. That's why I talked
Yes.
about why I don't like general enemy scaling. I do like making it so when you enter into an area, that area's level is set to your current level. So as this new
That's another
as
good
your
way to
player
do it. Yeah.
character gets higher level, when he goes into new places, he finds challenges there. But when he goes to old places, he finds them easier because he's more powerful.
Skyrim does that, but the issue with the way that Skyrim does it is that when you enter the cell for the first time, it scales to that. So if you enter a dungeon just to find it and see what's in it, and then you go out and you don't come back for another 30 levels, the next time you go in there, in many cases, it is still that same original level. So
that's
doesn't
kind of
always
my
work.
answer to that. It's kind of I hope you don't think it's ducking the question, because I do think it's a good question, but the answer isn't that RPGs should become easier or harder. It's they get easier in some places and harder in others. So I think that's all my thoughts on game difficulty. Many of which I did in my games, some of which I never did, but I wished I had. And so I hope that answers your question, Noah Calder 4279.
Another great video. Thank you, Tim, for that one. That was game difficulty settings. Here is the link for you guys. Give him a like and subscribe. I'm gonna save the 4 steps of fixing design problems for another day. So I'll end the YouTube recording for that one there. So if you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much. And I don't have anything to say. Just have a nice day.